But yeah, just to go back to this, we've been sponsored obviously by the Propel Hub, and the Propel Hub, actually what it stands for is Productivity Outcomes, Workplace Practice, Engagement and Learning. So this is a ESRC funded project, and it brings together 8 universities from the United Kingdom, looking at issues linked to productivity and engagement within organizations, various different research projects. So there really are about 6 projects which are very much focusing on that. And the whole purpose is to try to disseminate good practice and interesting ideas as they come out from the research amongst the interested parties and stakeholders. We're also sponsored by the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development. And again, they are clearly very interested in this whole issue of productivity and the productivity agenda, and across different sectors. And we've tried to roll this out for different sectors. And obviously today's event is much more looking at social care and kind of non-profit type employees as well. The final sponsor is the HPMA, and again that stands for Healthcare People Management Association, and again obviously clearly interested in HR issues looking in this particular sector. So unfortunately we can't be joined today by Nikki Ingram, who's the executive director from the HPMA, but she has provided a very short video, a very short welcome video, which I think we're just going to show now. Claire, our Wiz, is going to show us now on the technical front.
Hi everyone, my name's Nikki Ingham, and I'm proud to be the Executive Director for HPMA, Healthcare People Management Association. Hi everyone, my name's Nikki Ingham, and I'm proud to be the Executive Director for HPMA, Healthcare People Management Association. Really warm welcome to you all to this session today, which is on understanding human capital amongst social care employees. I'm sure you're in for a real treat. We recently launched at HPMA our HPMA Hub, which is a member-only area on our website. Please go and register, have a look. It has articles of interest, some evidence-based, of which the session is about today, sharing good practice and sharing excellence within the NHS around the workforce profession. Interestingly, it also has forums for topics of discussion, topics of interest, things you have a view about, an opportunity to really have your say and talk to like-minded people. So please go on to our members only area and have a look at the hub. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person, but I'm sure that you're going to have a really good session with Ulster University and understanding the human capital amongst social care employees. So sit back, engage in the session, embrace the learning and have a good time. Hopefully I'll see you all again soon. Thank you.
Okay, so it's great to have the support of Nikki and the HCPM. Sorry, I get a bit tongue-tied with that, with the HPMA, sorry. So in terms of today's event, we want to talk to you obviously about research which we have carried out amongst non-profit workers in the social care sector. So as you can see, the title slide here, as Denise has shared with you, it's myself and Denise, but also our colleague Catherine Venter from the University of Leicester has also been involved in the data collection for this. Unfortunately, Catherine can't be with us today either. So what we plan to do today is just give you a kind of a bit of a summary of what we looked at whenever it came to these case studies. So we looked at 3 case studies in Northern Ireland and in England, trying to really understand the whole issue about HRD, human resource development, engagement issues, and really the situation, what it's like on the ground for social care workers. And really, I guess what came out of this, the whole issue about human capital and social capital very much came to the fore, and that's what we want to spend our time speaking to you today about. And we I guess, as we went along here with the research, we thought it was coming out really interesting, and it provided quite a good snapshot and a good kind of synopsis of what's going on in the sector and what's it like to work in the sector as well. And I guess that's the crux of what we're going to look at today. And I think from our perspective, we have looked at this from a kind of case study perspective, but it'd be interesting to see what other people think about this and what the scenario is in other organizations. And I know we've got quite a number of practitioners and people who are involved in the sector registered today. So it'd be interesting to hear your voice towards the end of the session. We have a discussion. So just really without further ado, I think I'll pass over to Denise, who's going to take you through kind of literature and the theory regarding this. I'll then come back and speak about the findings. Okay, thanks. Okay, over to you, Denise.
Okay, thanks very much, Martin. So I'm Denise Currie. I'm from Queens University in Belfast. So just as Martin says, give a little bit of background, we wanted and we were interested in understanding the human resource development interventions that non-profit organisations in social care were making in what really is a very challenging environment. And I suppose when we did the research, we picked 3 case studies purposely identified because they were actually doing something really innovative in this area. And we realised, actually, there's great outcomes coming out here. But there was also some kind of outcomes that we needed to explore a little bit further. And so this is where we're coming to in terms of this paper, is that we wanted to explore this not just in terms of human capital and the knowledge, the skills, and so on, in terms of training interventions and how that was done in non-profit organisations, but also looking at the social capital, the organisational capital, and how that all interrelates. So we're going to explore that today to kind of make sense of the outcomes that we find in our case study. So just to give you a little bit of context, obviously, you are going to be very familiar with this given the audience, but the delivery of social care services are operating in an increasingly marketized environment. There's an increasing presence of private providers alongside non-profit organisations, as well as social care provided by the health and social care trusts or the local authorities. But the environment, the funding environment itself, for non-profits in particular, is really difficult. It's increasingly competitive. It can be unpredictable and is causing some sustainability challenges, let's say. And I think the real challenge is for non-profits in particular is that they're dealing with this competitive market where you have to be quite strategic, but alongside that, they have to deliver on their organisational mission, on their social goals. And really, for people who work in that sector, who choose to work in that sector, who choose to work in social care and generally, have a particular motivation, intrinsic motivation to do good. And that is often aligned with the mission and the goals of the organisation. So that kind of brought us to the research question as such, and really what we wanted to aim to do. We wanted to try to understand then the process through which the adoption of these human resource strategies in non-profit social care organisations leads, or maybe does not lead, to the attainment of social outcomes, whilst also remaining competitive and sustainable. And I think it is a real challenge, and we wanted to figure out what was happening, how it was happening. We did this using a framework called intellectual capital, and it's very much comes from the strategic management literature, and it might be a wee bit alien to organisations in the non-profit sector and so on, but I suppose the reality is that a lot of these organisations are operating in competitive markets and need to adopt professionalised management practices and so on. So we can think about it in these terms. So intellectual capital is essentially made up of 3 dimensions: organisational capital, human capital, and social capital. And it's about these 3 capitals working together in combination, in synergy, to create organisational value. And that in itself is the intellectual capital. It's the ability to leverage the knowledge derived from these other capitals to create some type of organisational value. So if we think about it in terms of social care organisations, that would be public service value, really. So before we go on, we'll do a bit of the theory and so on, just so you understand how we've analysed this and how we've made sense of all our outcomes. This is just a very simple diagram that kind of just shows how all the different capitals interrelate. So you've got your human capital resources, human capital, and that's initially what we were interested in. We wanted to see how non-profit social care providers were developing their human resources. But then how does that combine with the social capital and then the organisational capital? So social capital is essentially all about the knowledge derived from relationships in the organisation. And there is, 3 dimensions as well to social capital, and we're actually going to explore that in a little bit more detail later on in the session. But really, it's about these resources embedded within and available through and obtained from the relationships of an individual or organisation. So if you think about non-profit social care organisations, about the relationships individuals have with their colleagues, with their service users, with their managers, or with other stakeholders. And you can look at it in terms of the structure of the networks and whom each person kind of interacts with and communicates with, the relational dimension as well, which is really about the quality of those relationships and how well they interact and communicate. And then the cognitive dimension, which we think is really, really important for the nonprofit social care sector. So it represents the extent to which employees possess like a common language, shared values, shared narratives, and really that's underpinned by the shared purpose of that organisation and the mission. And this is really what ties a lot of the nonprofit organisations together, I think. So there's 3 dimensions now, and then there's organisational capital, the third one, and it's quite an encompassing term, but essentially it's the knowledge and the capabilities that are embedded within broad organisational structures, routines, processes, technologies, everything that makes up how that organisation is organised. Okay, the key thing here is that for intellectual capital and to be derived and organisational value to be leveraged, these 3 capitals need to work in synergy. And the theory really is that when that happens, there is like a virtual circle where there's further knowledge obtained, further capabilities developed, enhanced organisational learning, and it's really that then that delivers the organisational value or the public service value and whatnot. So that's a key aspect. Now, so if we consider though how you apply these capitals to the non-profit sector, especially in social care, you think about human capital resources, this is the most valuable asset, you could say, in non-profit organisations. And it's really because the people who work in social care will have this innate understanding of the needs of their service users, will have a very strong intrinsic motivation potentially to work in that sector. And that's really, I suppose, why non-profit organisations are valued so much in terms of the delivery of social care services. But on the other hand, within the environment that social care providers are operating under public sector contracts, where there's maybe performance outcomes that they have to align with, monitoring, reporting, and all certain accountability measures and everything else. There is an increasing need then for development of sophisticated management skills and best practice and training and development. There's obviously a need for mandatory qualifications in the area. And that's all great, but there is an argument that with emphasis on these hard managerial skills, there could be the potential to compromise the values-led human capital. That's the argument. On the other hand, then, social capital in non-profit organisations, it's all about neutrality, trust, commitment, loyalty, that shared identity, and as I've mentioned, that can be specifically quite strong in non-profit social care organisations, and what King would say it's the epitome of social capital in action. Again, when you're thinking about relationships, and if there is this focus on more professional management and hard management skills, there is the argument that relationships between management and employees can become strained. So how do you avoid that from happening? And lastly then, organisational capital. And I suppose when you compare the character of organisational capital in non-profit organisations compared to, for example, private organisations or public sector, you could say that the NPOs or non-profit organisations traditionally adopt a very informal management structure, where there's lots of flexibility. You know, it's been commented that it promotes a third way of organising, really. And again, in this sector, I suppose it's been challenged given the contracts that they have to work under to gain funding. So to gain legitimacy for operating under public sector contracts, non-profit organisations often have to adapt work practices to align to the expectations of that contract. And that might mean there's implications for employment practices, performance systems, and so on. And again, that feeds in, how does that align with the social mission of the organisation and the values of the people that work there? Okay, so, you know, this is a really useful framework to understand, you know, how all these things come together. And it is important, you know, as we said there, that these things need to mesh. There need to be synergy. I suppose what we've suggested here is that within the non-profit social care sector, that there could be, you know, there is maybe a greater emphasis on social capital, on those relationships. They're really, really important, and you know, that is what maybe makes the sector so unique. I suppose what we want to figure out is then, what's the implications of that then? You know, we looked at human resource development strategies, and this is really where we came to, is we're trying to figure out how all these capitals interrelate. Does this emphasis on social capital create dyssynergies where, you know, you're not going to get that virtual circle of outcomes? And that's really what's explored in the case studies that we looked at, and that's how we analysed it. So we did do 3 case studies, really interesting case studies, all doing very innovative things in around human resource development. So I'll just give you a little synopsis of what the case studies involved, and then Martin's going to give you a rundown on really what we found in terms of how these capitals manifested in each of the organisations. So the first case study we called Better Care Life. So this was a relatively small organisation, but they were delivering quite a good range of services. They very much were around trying to improve the quality of life and reduce isolation of people with disabilities. So their mantra was really about trying to create more inclusion for those with disabilities. They worked with adults, with children. They have residential services, community services, employment services, and so on. So there is a range of services on offer. As well, then there's a range. They had a range of funding avenues, which was critical, I think, for their story around how this all came together. They also had very professional, management practices and very sophisticated management practices. So Martin will talk more about that in a minute. Second, then we had support care. So this is an organisation that delivers range of services to support and enhance the lives of individuals and communities affected by HIV. So the services, for example, offering counselling, offering, help with getting employment and so on. They also involved a lot of volunteers in the organisation, and the volunteers also were a big part in delivering services. And then lastly, we have independence care. So independence care, again, a non-profit organisation, but delivering home care services or domiciliary care for older people, dependent adults, children and their families. So essentially it was, care workers going out to homes and delivering care that is needed according to specific care plans that have been set out by, for example, the Health and Social Care Trust's professionals. The key thing here with this organisation is that they were really trying to branch out into offering different services. They started to develop specialist services, and that was really key and an interesting part of their story as well. So I'll leave that now, and I'll pass over to Martin to take you through our analysis really and what we found.
Okay, so apologies about that, everyone. In terms of the methodology, we obviously did a lot of kind of qualitative interviews and focus groups amongst the different hierarchies within these organizations. And it's just really important for us to think about very briefly what some of the key findings were that came out. Now, as you can see, we've tried to structure this in terms of the different capitals as Denise described to you just previously: human capital, social capital, and organizational capital. So the first organization was Better Life Care. And again, as Denise described, this was very much kind of an organization which was, again, I suppose, very forward looking. It was very much looking at the whole issue of trying to enhance the lives of those people who were service users for them. And they were very innovation orientated. And this was the key kind of mission that they had, very much informed by that. The human capital, they looked at the type of people who they needed to recruit, and a very sophisticated recruitment selection policies there, looking across the piece in terms of skills, but also very much at the whole, the values and how they fitted with the culture of the organization. That this was vitally important. And again, aligned to the environmental influences. Again, Denise mentioned there the whole issue about funding and those sorts of things. I mean, a big element here, which whenever we spoke to the senior leaders and senior managers in this organization, was that they were really looking for thinking about lobbying, thinking at the political level and pushing the kind of boundaries in terms of that, so they could almost increase the pie, if you like, in terms of funding, trying to think in those sorts of terms. So very much aligned to that and understanding the complexity of the environment that they found themselves in. As mentioned before, the whole HR, performance management, recruitment selection, things linked to engagement and communication, all those kind of elements that HR governance issues were very, very aligned. Very much kind of we had HR managers who worked very closely with their senior leaders and team leaders and also staff on the ground as well, to really understand what was happening on the ground, to try to bring that innovative type ground bottom up type ideas to the fore. And very much a strong focus on development leaders, and the succession issue was something which we found clearly within that. So in terms of human capital, if you wanted to sum it up, I guess it could be very much looking at this very strong mission, very strong vision, and very strong kind of ethos within the organization. People very much bought into what they were trying to do here. And that then fed directly, as you would imagine, to the kind of social capital type idea, where we find really kind of strong collegial relationships, really positivity about working in this organization, and a real sense of loyalty and belonging amongst the employees at all levels. We found that, Denise mentioned camaraderie, and those things really coming to the fore. This shared values, this narrative, been all in it together, and they clearly bought into that and felt that this was their organization and they really wanted to make a difference to their service users. And that was one of the kind of key things which we clearly found within this organization. Now, again, so that it sounds all very kind of rosy in the garden in terms of what they were doing in this in Better Life Care. It was sophisticated. They had very much a kind of a sophisticated performance management tool in terms of organizational capital. Their structures, which they looked at regularly to try to make sure that there was, the whole issue about flow of information, reporting mechanisms, those sorts of things, and consultation was getting to the ground. That's one of the kind of key things we asked people whenever we were doing the interviews in the focus groups. How well did they feel communicated with? Did they feel they got the opportunities that they wanted in terms of HRD? And again, it was in terms of the organization, people were very happy and very kind of felt that it was an organization which they felt belonging to. And again, the chief executive officer quote there that we've got focused very much on model of practice, user-led approach, shift the commissioning. So again, this idea of really trying to influence the environment through lobbying, trying to really display best practice on the ground and trying to influence how that could influence commissioning going forward. Innovation was key in terms of their physical location, in terms of their premises, their training development suites, those sorts of things, really trying to push the boundaries in terms of how they looked at their service users and how they could help them in terms of different innovative practices, for example. This better way of doing things was a key thing. So therefore, ultimately, this very extremely positive about your experiences of work. And, this was one of the things. Now, with anything like this, we did ask about what's it like to work in this organization, particularly working with other organizations, perhaps the health service, with trusts, with other agencies and other organizations in this area. And again, there was at times this idea of social capital being stretched, where there were frustrations at perhaps kind of governance and some of those kind of things which came to the fore. But leaders, I think what we found, there was always this kind of falling back, that they felt that the leaders were really in there with them, fighting their corner, understanding where they were in terms of some of the issues that they had with delivering these kind of services under the kind of contract. So this is just a quote from one of the focus groups. And again, I kind of smile, and Denise probably just, we think back to this person talking about this, and I think it sums up very, very well. This was whenever somebody was working with a NHS colleague, but they had to use a photocopier for patient records, for example. And there's this idea of compliance where they had to be signed off, being able to use the photocopy, even though they were, a long service experienced employee. And they still had to go through this type of, checking off or ticking box type bureaucracy, I suppose they would have seen it. And this frustrated them. But I guess what came back was, whenever, maybe the latter half of that quote that we haven't included here, was that, they looked at the bigger picture and thinking about, well, what does this really mean? At the end of the day, we have to go through this whenever we're working with other organizations, but we'll get there because we're thinking about the service user at the end of the day and what this is going to help them going forward. So that was just a little bit about Better Life Care. The second case study was support care. And again, as Denise mentioned, they were very much looking at the kind of advice and trying to help people with HIV in communities and family members who were affected by this. Again, the context for this organization was very important in terms of the kind of human capital type element, which we saw here. There had been a recent round of redundancies, which very much kind of had impacted on this. This organization was in a relatively precarious position in terms of funding. Again, having to look at funding and really thinking innovatively about how they would try to increase funding or sustain funding within their area. And very much they looked at that in terms of the skills that their employees had, and this idea of a multi-skilled flexibility approach very much came to the fore here, where they thought about, well, what did people bring to the party, perhaps with additional things like marketing or communication or counselling, those sorts of things. How could they help the organization to be sustainable going forward? And not surprisingly, linked to this, we also had a kind of volunteer focus within this organization, because there were a lot of people who perhaps had experienced HIV, but had been able to then use that as a way of trying to help the organization and volunteer for the organization as well. And they were very much at the center of what the organization was all about as well. So using that human capital element as well. But again, referring back, remember that there were redundancies here, and that might have, we asked this question about, did people feel threatened by this and this idea of using volunteers, and that wasn't really the case, as you can see from the kind of quotation. The social capital, not surprisingly, again, a real kind of sense of purpose and loyalty and commitment to this, given the kind of purpose and what this organization was all about. Really strong relationships, people very much kind of experiencing things together, and that allowed for this idea of really rolling out different competencies, different knowledge which had been built up over the years to really try to enhance things. And that social capital really came to the fore. People had to talk to try to solve problems and think about what was actually happening on the ground with different clients and different service users. Organizational capital, again, if we think about that, much more organic, much more kind of flexible approach, and this idea of trying to maybe do more with less was a way of looking at it as well. Staff expected to do everything. Kind of service delivery coordinators focus group really came to the fore there, where maybe doing a bit of reception work, a bit of marketing work, a bit of counselling, those sorts of things. And it sounds a bit kind of haphazard and ad hoc, but they were very much bought into what they were trying to do to try to sustain this organization. And that's really what we saw come into the fore here. The quote again sums it up. Whenever we spoke about the context of redundancies, that there wasn't really that feeling of threat from volunteers. It was just, again, going back to this idea of the social care ethos, the kind of mission and values, really trying to think about the service user and really trying to help them. And whatever way they could navigate a path through this is what they were trying to do. So that was the key issue there. In terms of another quote coming from someone from the focus group, talk about, I find I have to use everything I know and have in order to survive because we are stretched across, and being a charity, you're not just a specialist position, you have to be able to do this and that and the other, so that you cover other areas. So this idea of being able to fill in, using different skills, we're willing to learn new skills, been overstretched, doing a bit of kind of reception, working with the volunteers, for example, but plugging holes. And again, there were issues with that. Whilst that was very good and this very kind of all in it together type approach, how long can that last for? And that was, again, this issue of sustainability very much coming to the fore. And, I spoke about the kind of organisational capital and the flexible structures and those things. We just felt that there comes a time whenever this maybe has to become more formalized to make this sustainable going forward. So that was a little bit about support care. And the final organization was independence care. Now, again, they were a bit different in terms of the human capital. This idea of the context been more reactive to funding opportunities. This organization, again, very much in the kind of domiciliary home help type area, and that was, again, an issue in terms of funding. We would have spot purchasing, for example, those sorts of things, again, where the organization sometimes would have to compete for clients and service users and those sorts of things, and again have to think about care packages in the most efficient and competitive way. But they were also innovation oriented, and again, that's one of the reasons why we looked at this organization as a case study. And they were trying to develop specialist services, for example, in diabetes care and other things as well. But I guess maybe an issue in terms of that, they were very much kind of selecting different people who could impart this kind of service. It wasn't kind of rolled out across the piece in the organization. They had to be selective because of funding issues as well, but still very much aligned to the organizational mission, if you like. The social capital, again, if you think about the context that these employees were working in, sometimes it was quite isolated, it was quite rural in their outlook, and therefore there was maybe a lack of a kind of community of practice coming to the fore. There was less sharing of best practice amongst the employees on the ground, even though the organization did try to use technology in terms of apps and things like that. But there was this kind of feeling of isolation, I guess, coming to the fore, some stress, dissatisfaction, and linked to that, very much kind of coming to it's kind of more kind of fragmented type organization. There was a bit of a kind of them and us culture between management, who again had their own challenges, and employees who had their challenges on the ground. And that again fed through to the organizational capital type aspect as well. Again, very formal structure, because it had to be to try and manage this kind of quite wide ranging organization and this quite dispersed. But often that seemed to be kind of counterproductive in terms of the kind of effectiveness of developing those services throughout rural areas. And again, there were issues there in terms of reorganization, and they had tried to reorganize. And the Deputy Chief Executive Officer, again, sums it up very well. First talks about this idea of becoming more centralized and closing rural locations who maybe would have had a more identifying with the kind of employees, more contact face-to-face on the ground now, but that was lessened because of the centralisation and the organisational capital changes which had happened there, and this loss of local knowledge. But again, it goes back to this whole idea that there was a kind of a bit of a needs must. They had to think about centralisation, they had to think about competition and how they were going to compete in this kind of environment where they found themselves in. So just some of the kind of quotes which came out here, there were frustrations clearly, someone talking here about having to drive 80 miles a part for looking at clients with needing dialysis, for example. And again, there's a very stressful type environment. Also, this idea of a participant noting that she felt been played on, that very much the kind of values that people would fall into line and do things, even though it was very difficult for them, perhaps logistically on the ground, and putting in a lot of hours, for example, and a lot of stress going back to what people are actually been asked to do on the ground. And again, this idea of feeling guilty, if you like, and really playing on the kind of values-based social capital that Denise spoke about before. So we saw this within this type of organisation more so than the others. But clearly, I think the key thing to say, and Denise, if you move on to the next slide, I guess, that we were trying to understand this across the piece in terms of these organisations, and we felt it was a useful way of looking at it. If I start with independence care first, and again that's organisation we've just spoken about, you can see the kind of circles there that we illustrated. Very much kind of human capital resources were very good. I mean, these were highly skilled and values-driven employees. The issue here is that, I guess, the social capital was been stretched in terms of we're very much relying upon those kind of values, relying on this kind of service orientation that these employees would have had. The organisational capital we felt was a smaller circle here because we felt it wasn't developed very well for the needs of what the organisation was all about. But again, we think about the kind of the context, the less independence which that organisation actually had. Again, the whole influence and the power which the kind of funders, institutional environment which they had in comparison with the actual organisation itself. And again, that kind of created what we call this a bit of a kind of vicious circle. If you look at the other side, I guess the organisation Better Life Care was more of a kind of virtuous circle, I guess we would describe it, because we saw much more balance there. And again, what was that related to? The kind of organisational capital very much in place, maybe more professional in their outlook, thinking about structured scorecards, those sorts of things to try to balance these things up, thinking about how they could best get information up and down the hierarchy within the different employee levels. But also think about the context and greater independence, and again, less influence and power of the funders. They could almost kind of plough their own furrow to some extent in terms of what they were trying to do. Again, very good human capital resource, and I think in all these organisations that's something that we would emphasise. We were dealing with very highly motivated, highly skilled employees who were really bought into the mission and the values of what the organisations were all about. I guess the issue is about the organisational capital. In the middle there, we had support care, which we describe as kind of vacillating cycle, if you like, because it was kind of moving around a little bit and maybe not so easy to define in terms of the other two organisations. But clearly, you could see that social capital, again, was been stretched a little bit there, and organisational capital needed to be developed. Again, there's a lot of kind of flexibility and I guess maybe a little bit ad hoc, but that was the necessity for the environment they found themselves in, given the kind of funding issues, given the need to use volunteers, to use stretch employees to some extent to do different roles. So I guess this is how we tried to sum the whole thing up and tried to look at the case study organisations. Yeah, if you just want to move on again to the final kind of slide, which we've got here, which I guess kind of implications of all of this, what does it mean, I guess? Well, NPOs, again, increasingly been tasked with delivering these public services, but often have to play this to the tune of kind of powerful funders. And again, we saw that in a couple of organisations, very much kind of more so the kind of issue of independence care, being able to think in a more kind of how would I say the best way to describe it? They had to kind of play to that and what they were actually doing. Better Life Care, again, maybe been able to influence those things a little bit better in terms of their independence and strategic decision making. This whole issue about lobbying, for example, again, and very much institutional pressures and funding issues, constraints, the NPO's ability to leverage human capital resources. And again, that was one of the issues, how much kind of training and development HRD could you use, and the whole issue of specialist skills to deal with innovation. And again, as we said before, if you take independence care, who were trying to be very innovative, but then it was very difficult to kind of stretch those resources across a very rural area, for example. And again, this idea of kind of complementary compensation by social capital, asking employees to go above and beyond sometimes was an issue. And we saw that again in support care as well. obviously what I've spoken about, the context has been vitally important, and understanding that context. And again, we think about this in terms of other sectors. Do non-profit sector employees maybe tolerate more than what others would? And that's an issue, I guess, which we need to think about. But obviously, for organizations like this, it's the kind of it's the context that we find ourselves in, that employees will be that more kind of vocational social care type missions and values orientation. The big issue again is this kind of vicious cycle, and I guess what we're saying here, potentially to create this kind of social capital increasingly used to try and compensate for poor organization capital in terms of structure and flexibility and those things. And I guess we have discussed this many times, Denise, Catherine, and myself, and we kind of use the analogy of almost like an elastic band, where there's so much kind of stretch you can have, but eventually will that break, and people will begin to say, okay, well, I can't continue to do this because there is a lot of pressure and stress being placed on these employees. But again, there's so many things going on here, and I think this is our kind of get out clause here. It's a very complex area. We're trying to put some kind of sense into it and trying to clarify these things, but I think that's why an event like this it's quite interesting to hear your voices and try and see what are some of the issues maybe on the ground that perhaps we need to think about to try to understand this in a more holistic way.